The rain wasn't just falling that Friday afternoon. It was hammering the glass walls of the boardroom so hard, it drowned out the sound of my own heartbeat. I could feel the chill of the air conditioner seeping through my suit jacket as I sat there, hands folded, waiting for the moment I thought would finally change everything. The conference table gleamed under the recessed lights, polished to a mirror finish, and I could see my distorted reflection staring back at me. Tired eyes, too much hope, not enough caution. My father stood at the head of the table, clearing his throat, the small silver cufflinks I'd bought him years ago, catching a flash of white light. My brother Jacob leaned back in his chair, swirling the ice in his glass, like he was waiting for a show instead of a succession announcement. Then Dad said the words that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. "My successor will be Jacob Hayes." The murmur spread a low rustle like dry leaves. Jacob's smirk dragged across his face, slow and oily. I felt the warmth drain from my hands. Dad wasn't done. He opened a folder, one I had never seen before, and the sharp click echoed across the table like a gun cocking. "There have been irregularities," he said. "Unauthorized actions, all traced back to Michael." Security stepped behind me. The carpet felt unsteady under my shoes, and Jacob leaned forward, the faint scent of cologne and whiskey drifting across the table, whispering, "It's just business, little brother." For a moment, the whole world narrowed to the sound of rain pounding the windows and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. That was the moment I learned what it felt like to have your life yanked out from under you while the people who should have protected you pushed the knife in deeper. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Michael Hayes, and I was 40 years old on the day my father fired me from the very company I'd spent my entire adult life trying to save. Back when this story really began, though, I was just 25, a kid fresh out of business school, still ironing my shirts too stiff and drinking gas station coffee at dawn because I didn't know any better. I remember the smell of burnt espresso in the office kitchen and the soft buzz of old computers warming up in the morning. Dad had built Hayes Tech from nothing, but by then it was running on fumes. I could feel the heaviness in the building every day, like the walls knew we were close to losing everything. Dad was always a man of sharp angles, sharp tone, sharp temper, sharp distinction between his sons. Jacob was the golden one, broad smile, easy laugh, that loud slap on the back charm people mistake for leadership. Whenever he walked into a room, Dad's face would light up just a little. When I walked in, Dad would glance at his watch. Maybe clear his throat. Maybe tell me to work on my presence. Even then, the favoritism wasn't loud. It was subtle. A lingering hand on Jacob's shoulder. A distracted nod for me. When Jacob burned through corporate funds, taking clients to nightclubs, Dad said he was building relationships. When I pointed out the numbers, Dad's voice grew quiet, too quiet, and he'd say, "Michael, don't nitpick." People don't like a nitpicker. I learned early that silence was the safest place for me. Keep your head down. Work harder. Don't complain. Don't give him a reason to see how small you sometimes feel, standing next to your own brother. But the day that truly set everything in motion was a Tuesday in November, cold enough that my breath fogged as I walked into the office. I found Dad hunched over his desk, the blinds barely open, letting in a thin gray line of winter light across the papers scattered everywhere. His shoulders were trembling not from anger, but from something worse. Defeat. I could hear the faint rasp of his breathing, the kind you hear when someone's been crying, but doesn't want you to know. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he whispered, "It's over, Michael. I'm losing the company." The room smelled faintly of cold coffee and dust. the scent of a dream slipping away. I felt something shift inside me, something I didn't tell anyone for years. Because in that moment, I wasn't thinking about favoritism or old hurts. All I saw was my father, flawed, stubborn, blind, to so much crumbling under the weight of failure. And all I could think was, I can't let him fall. I told him I'd fix it, that I'd handle it. He didn't believe me, not really, but he didn't stop me either. He just leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, looking suddenly older than 68. Outside his office, I could hear Jacob laughing with someone on the phone, the muffled sound of ice clinking against a glass. He had no idea how close we were to losing everything. Or maybe he just didn't care. That was the first quiet injustice the moment I realized Dad would let me save the company, but still never see me as the son worth choosing. And I had no idea back then how much that blind loyalty would cost me when the day of the board meeting finally arrived. The sound of the TV filled the living room that Christmas morning, bright and tinny, as the glow from the tree lights blinked across the carpet. I must have been 9 or 10. I remember the coldness of the hardwood floor under my knees as I searched for my name on the tags piled around the tree. Dad's laugh rolled through the room, deep, warm, that version of him that only seemed to appear when Jacob was nearby. My brother tore the wrapping paper off a huge box, the kind you could climb into. A new bike, silver and red, shining under the lights like it had been polished for days. Dad clapped him on the back. "That's my boy," he said, his voice rich with pride. I waited for him to turn toward me. I waited for the smile to include me. But he didn't. My gifts sat off to the side in a neat little stack: 2 shirts, a book about computers, and a baseball glove that still smelled like the store's leather polish. Mom said gently, "Michael, why don't you open yours?" Her voice sounded soft, too soft, like she already knew what I didn't want to admit. The tree lights flickered in her glasses as she watched me unwrap the book. The room felt colder then, even with the heat running. Jacob circled the living room on his new bike, the rubber tires squeaking on the polished floor, while I sat quietly on the rug, pretending the pages of that book were more interesting than they were. Dad never said a word to me that morning. Not one. Years later, I still remember the faint scent of pine needles and wrapping paper, and how it felt like the air itself had left me behind. The thing about childhood memories is they don't fade. Just because you grow older, they settle in your bones, waiting to explain things you didn't understand until much later. Looking back now, I can see the pattern started long before that Christmas. The favoritism wasn't shouted. It wasn't announced. It lived in the space between moments, the way Dad's voice softened around Jacob and sharpened with me, the way his eyes lingered on the older son but skimmed past the younger. When I was in middle school, Dad coached Jacob's baseball team. I remember those summer evenings, the smell of cut grass and the grit of dirt on my sneakers as I sat on the bleachers pretending to do homework. Dad's shout carried across the field full of pride when Jacob hit a line drive. He'd pump his fist grin wide, call him champ. I tried out the next year. I practiced for weeks, throwing until my shoulder ached, swinging until blisters formed on my palms. On tryout day, the sun was blazing, the metal bat hot against my hands. I swung with everything I had. The ball soared over second base. A clean hit. Dad nodded once. "Not bad," he said. "But focus more." Jacob jogged past me, patting my shoulder. "Don't worry. Sports just aren't your thing." Dad didn't correct him. I felt the sting of it more than the blisters. The heat of the afternoon seemed to press against my skin, heavy and unforgiving. I stood there with the smell of dirt and sweat in the air, pretending his words didn't matter. pretending I didn't see Dad's smile a few minutes later when Jacob swung. It was always like that, Jacob shining under every spotlight, and me learning to stand quietly at the edges. By high school, I'd stopped trying to compete. I joined the computer club instead. The room was always too cold, humming with the sound of old machines. I liked that sound. It didn't ask anything of me. It didn't compare me to anyone. But even then, Dad would say, "You need to be more like your brother." Confident, outgoing. People don't follow the quiet ones. He said it without malice, without thought. But it cut all the same. Mom tried to soften it, brushing my hair back gently, or setting my favorite meal in front of me without a word. But she couldn't change him. She couldn't change the way he'd look past me at the dinner table asking Jacob about his plans, his friends, his weekend, his everything. Sometimes I'd speak up just a little. A thought about school, a question about the business he was starting. But Dad's answer was always the same, tone distracted, polite, the way you respond to someone who's interrupting something important. Those moments taught me something I didn't realize until adulthood. Silence can become a habit. It can become a way of surviving. When I was 15, I overheard a conversation between Dad and one of his friends in the backyard. The grill smoke drifted through the air, smelling of charcoal and garlic, and I stood just inside the sliding door, half hidden behind the curtain. Dad's friend asked about his sons. Robert chuckled. "Jacob's a natural. He's got charm drive. He'll lead something big one day." "And Michael?" There was a pause. I can still feel it, the heaviness of it, the way the late afternoon heat pressed against my back as I waited for his answer. Dad shrugged. "He's a good kid. Reliable. Just not a leader." His friend made a soft sound, something like a sympathetic hum. Dad changed the subject before I heard anything else. I went upstairs and closed my door, feeling the texture of the wood grain under my fingertips as I leaned against it. The house was quiet, except for the muffled laughter drifting in from the yard. That was the first time I truly believed I wasn't someone worth betting on. These little cuts added up over the years, holidays, family barbecues, birthdays where my gifts were an afterthought and Jacob's were events. I learned to keep my voice low, my head down, my expectations small. I convinced myself that being reliable was enough, that being invisible was safer than being a disappointment. When I joined Hayes Tech after college, I still carried all that with me. The office smelled of dust and old carpet, the air too warm from overworked heaters in winter and too cold in summer. Dad would walk through the halls with Jacob at his side, pointing things out, talking big-picture strategy. When I entered a room, Dad's expression shifted more serious, more guarded, as if I were a reminder of something he didn't want to examine. Jacob had natural swagger. He'd throw an arm around Dad's shoulders, laugh loud, toss, playful jabs my way. Everyone thought we had a normal brotherly rivalry. They didn't see how Dad's eyes softened at Jacob's jokes, or how they hardened at my suggestions. I tried to brush it off, tried to tell myself I was imagining it. But I felt it in the temperature of the room, the warmth that followed Jacob like sunlight, and the cooler draft that seemed to settle around me. Over time, I internalized it. I worked harder, stayed later, carried the weight no one else wanted. Quietly. Always quietly. Dad's approval wasn't my goal anymore, just his acknowledgement. A nod, a look, something. It never came. By the time the company was collapsing, I was 35 and already conditioned to be the shadow in every room. When I found Dad crumpled over his desk, the blue glow from his monitor reflecting off his glasses, it didn't surprise me that he looked through me before he looked at me. I stepped in anyway. I always did. And as Hayes Tech began to rise again because of the long nights, the calls, the endless work I poured into it, I felt a flicker of something dangerous. Hope. Maybe if I saved his dream, he'd finally see me. But every victory was credited to Jacob. Dad would say he was the face of the company, the visionary. I was operations, a supportive role, the reliable son with the background tasks. It should have hurt less over time. It didn't. Jacob knew exactly how to play into it, little digs disguised as jokes tapping my shoulder when he passed my desk. His voice dipped in that familiar tone of condescension. And Dad never corrected him, not once. The years layered themselves inside me. The ignored efforts, the missed celebrations, the backhanded compliments. They built a quiet ache I carried everywhere like a weight in my chest that tightened whenever Dad praised Jacob in front of me. I didn't speak up, not once. Not because I didn't know how, but because part of me still believed Dad might be right, that I wasn't the leader, that Jacob deserved the spotlight, that I should just be grateful to hold the pieces together behind the scenes. But something shifted the year before Dad retired. It was small, almost invisible. A moment I didn't even understand then. One afternoon, as I walked past Dad's office, I heard him speaking in a low tone, too low for anyone else to catch. There was tension in the air, the kind that makes your skin prickle. "I trust you, Jacob," Dad said. "You're the only one I can count on." Jacob murmured something I couldn't hear. And then Dad added, "Michael means well, but he's not built for leadership." The words floated through the cracked door, carried on the faint hum of the air purifier. I froze in the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, feeling the truth settle like cold water down my spine. That moment stayed with me quietly, steadily, until the day of the board meeting. Because some wounds don't heal, they just wait for their moment, and mine was about to find its voice. The cursor blinked on my father's office computer, the soft hum of the tower filling the room like a steady warning. I hadn't meant to stay late that night. The hallway outside was already dark, lit only by the faint green glow of the exit signs. But something about the way Dad hurried out earlier, avoiding eye contact, leaving his coffee half-finished, had made my stomach tighten. When I clicked open the first folder on his desktop, a spreadsheet loaded dense with numbers and dates. My eye caught a line highlighted in pale yellow. Then another, a third. A cold draft slipped under the office door as I opened the attached memo, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering once, then stabilizing. My brother's name sat at the bottom of every irregular entry. Payments approved, but never recorded. Signatures that didn't match the dates. Client accounts marked lost due to mismanagement with a digital trail that led directly back to him. Another file opened with a double click. Emails. Dozens of them. My father and Jacob exchanging messages about removing bottlenecks, correcting unauthorized deviations, and preparing the board for transition. My name wasn't in the emails themselves. It was in the subject lines, in the red-tagged folders marked Concerns. I clicked one. My breath caught as the email opened my father's words cold and flat through the screen glow. Michael cannot continue making decisions without oversight. We need leverage ready. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air too warm. Then I clicked the last attachment, a scanned document, my father's signature, and Jacob's, a draft termination letter dated 6 months earlier. The shock of it burned through me before I could even name it. That moment staring at that letter was the first time I realized the betrayal hadn't started at the board meeting. It had begun long before. Quietly, deliberately. For years, I had believed the only wounds in our family came from silence, favoritism, old habits that Dad never challenged. But the files on that screen told another story, one built on strategy planning and intent. The glow from the monitor illuminated the edges of the office, catching on the framed awards on the wall. Awards I had earned. Awards Dad said were team achievements. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and the cedar polish the cleaning crew used. It grounded me just enough to keep scrolling. I found a thread that stretched back nearly a decade. 10 years of emails and approvals that painted the same picture: Jacob stumbling through the business, losing accounts, mishandling funds, and Dad quietly patching over it with every tool he had. Every time I'd saved the company from collapse, those endless nights, the meetings, the spreadsheets I rebuilt from scratch, my father had erased the mistakes and protected the son he actually believed in. I clicked an older email. The date was only a month after I'd convinced our biggest client to stay with us. My father's message said, "Jacob, don't worry. I'll make sure Michael doesn't take this as permission to act on his own." Permission. That word stung in a way I didn't expect. I remembered the day Dad had praised Jacob publicly for restoring confidence in our client relationships. Jacob had stood in the center of the break room, smiling his easy smile while the staff clapped. My father put a hand on my shoulder afterward and said, "Your work helped too, son. But Jacob has the natural touch. Learn from that." That memory had settled somewhere deep inside me years ago. I'd buried it, told myself it wasn't worth remembering. But now, seeing the email timestamps sent the night before that announcement, something cold spread through me. I clicked further. There were private meetings between Dad and board members, meetings I hadn't known about, held in quiet restaurants where the lighting was low and the receipts tucked away. Every discussion centered on Jacob's eventual leadership. My contributions were framed as temporary or situational support. The more I read, the more I realized the truth. They had always planned to give him the company. My work had only delayed their timeline. My hands felt tight on the mouse, the plastic warm under my palm. As I scrolled through one last email, the building's HVAC kicked on, sending a faint, cool breeze across my neck. In it, Dad wrote, "We need to prepare documentation in case Michael resists the transition." Resists. As if I were a problem to be managed, not the reason the company was still alive. For a long time, I didn't move. The office felt too still, too quiet, except for the faint hum of the monitor and the distant ticking of the wall clock. Eventually, I reached the folder labeled Succession Planning. The title alone made my chest feel heavy. I clicked it open. Inside were 2 versions of a succession letter. The first, written 5 years prior, named me as interim CEO should a crisis arise. It was saved, but never printed. The second, created just 2 months ago, named Jacob as successor, citing consistent demonstration of leadership. My father had chosen the draft he wanted to believe, and he had chosen it long before he told me I was the future of the company. A knot tightened in my throat, not because I was surprised, but because I finally understood how deep the deception ran. My father had never considered me equal to Jacob, and Jacob had weaponized that knowledge in every way he could. There was a financial document I nearly missed buried in a folder mislabeled Q3 projections. When I opened it, the lines of text didn't make sense at first. Then they did. Transfers, withdrawals, reimbursements that weren't reimbursements. Money moved from corporate accounts into shell companies, then into Jacob's personal holdings. My father's initials were beside most of the approvals. I sat back, the leather of the chair cool against my spine. The office felt claustrophobic, the shadows lengthening as the building lights shifted into nighttime mode. It hit me then, the betrayal wasn't just emotional. It wasn't just favoritism. It was fraud. It was criminal. And they had used my work to cover the cracks. As the realization settled, something inside me shifted. A quietness, almost a steadiness, took hold. The kind that comes not from shock, but from clarity. For the first time in my life, the weight I carried wasn't self-doubt. It was proof. Every file, every email, every hidden transaction, they all told the same story. I had saved a company that had already decided I didn't matter. My father's love had always been conditional. His trust had always been reserved for the son who hadn't earned it, and I had been the tool they used to keep the illusion alive. But not anymore. The anger I expected didn't show up. Not then. What came instead was resolve, slow, deliberate, like a gate closing in my mind. The years of being overlooked, dismissed, managed. They crystallized into something sharp and undeniable. I closed one window, then another, saving everything to an encrypted drive I had never told anyone about. The carpet felt steady under my shoes when I stood. I glanced once more around the office, the awards, the framed photos, the empty coffee mug on Dad's desk. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. This wasn't my office. This wasn't my legacy. And it never would be, not under their control. I didn't slam the door when I left. I didn't need to. The silence behind me felt like something breaking in a clean, permanent line. As I walked to my car, the night air was cool against my face, carrying the faint scent of rain. I unlocked the door, sat inside, and stared at the dark windshield for a long moment. Then I reached for my phone. There was a number I hadn't dialed in years, a friend who understood systems compliance, the law. Someone who wouldn't ask questions. My hand hovered for a breath. Then I tapped the screen. It was time to stop being the quiet son. Time to stop accepting the role they had written for me. Time to act. And the next move would change everything. Jacob froze with his hand halfway to the conference table, the morning sunlight catching the sheen of sweat rising across his forehead. The boardroom had gone silent, the kind of silence that hums in the air just before something breaks. My laptop screen glowed on the center of the table, and the audio file I'd queued up filled the room with a single unmistakable sentence in my brother's voice. Just make sure the payment clears. Dad doesn't need to know Michael covered the cost. Chairs scraped lightly as heads turned toward him. Papers lay forgotten. Dad's face drained of color, his mouth slightly open, as he stared at the speakers like they'd betrayed him personally. Jacob reached for the laptop, but I slid it out of his grasp, the cool metal brushing my fingertips. The air felt charged warm under the recessed lights, thick with shock. He tried to speak, but the next recording played automatically, his voice again, low and careless, discussing a deal he'd hidden under my name. The room sucked in a collective breath. The scent of polished wood and brewed coffee mingled with tension so sharp it felt like the air itself could shatter. By the time the third clip started, Jacob's hand trembled against the table, and I finally raised my eyes to meet his. You need to understand how the room ended up frozen like that. How we reached the point where the truth stopped being a whisper and became something undeniable. I hadn't planned that morning lightly. Every bit of evidence I carried, every recording, every buried document, every email had been gathered in silence over years of being overlooked. I'd spent the weekend preparing the glow of my home office lamp reflecting off printed pages spread across my desk. The air had smelled of ink and cedar from the old drawers I kept my drives in. When dawn broke on the day of the confrontation, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, calm. This wasn't revenge? Not really. It was simply the truth finally standing upright. The board had called an emergency meeting after several department heads raised questions about new directives Jacob issued overnight. Directives that immediately eroded client relationships I had spent years building. When I walked into the conference room, the carpet soft under my shoes, I felt the temperature drop a few degrees. People were waiting, watching, unsure which version of the Hayes brothers they were about to see. Dad sat at the head of the table, adjusting his tie with that familiar stiffness he used whenever he felt cornered. Jacob lounged in his chair, one ankle resting over his knee. His polished shoe bouncing lightly a tell I remembered from childhood, a habit he had when he thought he'd already won. I placed my laptop on the table. He didn't notice the slight tremble in my fingers. Or maybe he thought it was fear. But the truth was, for the first time in a long time, my hands shook with certainty. When I pressed play on the first recording, Jacob's jaw tightened. The board leaned forward slightly, the faint rustle of fabric brushing across chairs. Dad cleared his throat once, then again, a small cough that didn't hide the panic rising in his eyes. The audio filled the room. Jacob's voice casually discussing a client account he'd sabotaged, his tone dripping with the arrogance he thought no one could challenge. "What is this?" Dad demanded, but his voice wavered. "Evidence," I said quietly. "The kind you said I never had." A soft gasp came from the far end of the table. The overhead lights flickered faintly, casting moving shadows across the framed company vision statement on the wall, Innovation, Integrity, Leadership. Jacob pushed back in his chair. "Dad, this is taken out of context. He's manipulating the second recording." Cut him off. "Clearer. More damning." His voice arranging to reroute funds through an account under my employee ID. The room shifted. People exchanged glances. I could hear the faint hum of the projector overhead, the steady tick of the wall clock marking each passing second of his unraveling. Dad's fingers dug into the edge of the table. "Jacob, what is this?" But it was the third recording that broke whatever grip Jacob still had on the room. Because in it, he wasn't just stealing. He wasn't just lying. He was orchestrating a narrative, one he'd fed Dad for years. "Look, if I spin this right, they'll think Michael approved the transfer. He signs things without reading anyway. Dad'll believe me. He always does." The boardroom fell into a thick, breathless stillness. Jacob went pale. Dad's gaze dropped to his hands as if the truth had landed there and burned. But the twist, the part I hadn't shared with anyone yet, waited in the folder beside my laptop. I opened it slowly, feeling the smooth paper between my fingers. A set of printed emails, not just between Jacob and Dad, but between Jacob and our chief accountant. My voice was steady when I spoke. "This is the part you never expected me to find." I held the first page up. "Jacob didn't just use my name to hide his mistakes," I said. "He forged my signature on financial statements. Statements tied to tax filings." Dad's head snapped up. "What?" The board leaned forward as I laid the documents on the table. The faint scent of toner drifted up from the pages. The forged copies contained my initials, my handwriting copied with eerie precision. A few board members recoiled slightly. Our accountant had annotated one of the emails in handwriting. The note read, "Jacob insisted on using Michael's signature. Said Robert approved." Dad closed his eyes, his breath shaky. "I never approved that," he whispered. I nodded. "I know, but he told them you did, and he told them I wouldn't notice." The room's atmosphere thickened, the kind of heaviness that follows a truth too large to ignore. Jacob stood abruptly, the chair legs squealing against the floor. "This is a setup," he snapped. "He's jealous. He's always been jealous." "Enough." Dad's voice cracked like a whip. It echoed against the glass walls, sharp and unsteady. For the first time in my life, he looked at Jacob with something other than pride. He looked at him with horror. I clicked one last file on my laptop, An entire folder opened screenshots, dates, transaction trails. And at the center of it all was the twist Jacob never saw coming. "Dad," I said softly, "the reason the IRS visited last year wasn't random. It was triggered by those falsified documents." Gasps rippled through the room. Jacob's face twisted, panic spreading like heat under his collar. He shook his head, words tumbling out uselessly. "You dragged the entire company into risk," I said. "Not by accident, not because you were overwhelmed, but because you used my identity to cover your tracks. You created a problem so big you needed Dad to save you and blame me for the fallout." A board member slammed a pen down. "This is criminal," she whispered. The balance in the room shifted with a force I could almost feel, like a tide pulling hard in my direction. Dad looked at Jacob, his voice barely more than a breath. "Is this true?" Jacob didn't answer. He didn't need to. The evidence answered for him. The board chair spoke next, her tone firm and final. "Effective immediately, Jacob Hayes is suspended pending a full investigation." Another voice added, "And we'll be involving outside counsel." Jacob's gaze shot to me, wild, furious, desperate. "You did this," he hissed. "You forged my life," I answered quietly. "I just opened the curtain." Security entered the room, summoned silently by a gesture I didn't see. Jacob's steps were uneven as they guided him toward the door, his breath loud and ragged in the stunned quiet. Dad didn't try to stop them. He didn't even look up. As the door clicked shut behind Jacob, the room stayed silent, the weight of everything lingering in the warm, still air. I closed my laptop, the cool metal grounding me. No one spoke, not at first. Then the board chair exhaled slowly. "Michael, what do you intend to do now?" I rose from my seat, feeling the tension in my shoulders finally loosen after years of carrying what no one else would. The morning light spilled across the conference room floor, warm against my shoes as I moved toward the door. "We rebuild," I said, "but not like this." And I walked away, leaving behind a room still suspended in silence, the truth echoing in every corner. When I stepped out of the conference room, the hallway felt strangely quiet, as if the building itself had paused to breathe. The carpet muffled my footsteps, and every sound seemed distant, the soft hum of the vents, the faint buzz of overhead lights. Behind me, the door eased shut with a gentle click, sealing the chaos inside. For a moment, I stood there with my hand still on the doorknob, feeling the cool metal against my palm, realizing something I hadn't been able to admit for decades. The weight I'd carried since childhood wasn't on my shoulders anymore. It was on theirs. I exhaled the breath long and steady, and walked down the hallway with a clarity that made the morning light spilling through the windows seem brighter somehow. Each step felt deliberate, grounded. Something had shifted. Something inside me had finally settled into place. That quiet in the hallway stayed with me for a long time as I began the slow work of rebuilding what should have been mine all along. In the weeks that followed, Hayes Tech untangled itself from the lies my father and brother had woven. Attorneys took over, auditors dug through years of records, and the board reached out to me more often than I ever expected. But I didn't return to the old office. I couldn't. The building smelled of old carpet and furniture polish, with memories tucked in every corner. Too many of them heavy, too many of them lonely. Instead, I focused on reclaiming something else myself. I moved into a small, historic house on the north side of town. A place with uneven floors and a porch that creaked under my weight. When I first unlocked the door, the air inside was cool and still, carrying a faint scent of cedar and old paint. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, dust swirling gently in the beams. It was quiet in a comforting way, the kind of quiet that didn't demand anything from me. I repainted the downstairs walls over a long weekend. The roller made a soft, steady sound against the plaster, and each new coat of color felt like wiping a slate clean. In the evenings, I opened the windows and let the warm breeze push through the rooms, carrying out the last traces of whoever lived there before me. There was something healing in those simple motions, the scrape of the paint tray, the fresh scent of primer, the way my body ached from work that belonged only to me. Reclaiming the company wasn't my goal. Reclaiming my worth was. My father called once, then again. His voice on the voicemail was unsteady, as though age had finally caught him. He wanted to explain. He wanted to rewind things that couldn't be rewound. I listened to the messages but didn't respond. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned out the moment the truth came into the light. But distance felt necessary, like letting a wound breathe after years of infection. Jacob didn't call. Maybe he knew there was nothing left to say. Or maybe he finally understood that some bridges can't be rebuilt, not because of punishment, but because of peace. I set boundaries quietly, without announcements or declarations. A new phone number, a new email, a new life that didn't revolve around earning love that had never been offered freely in the first place. And somewhere in the middle of those weeks, I realized I wasn't doing any of it alone. My closest colleague, Anna, brought coffee to my new porch one Saturday morning, the aroma warm and comforting as the sun rose over the neighborhood. She didn't pry or ask for the story behind the story. She just sat with me while the world slowly brightened. Those small gestures, quiet companionship, the soft clink of ceramic mugs, the breeze rustling the leaves felt more grounding than any victory inside a boardroom ever had. Others reached out too, former teammates, clients I'd supported for years, people who had seen the truth long before I had. Their messages weren't grand, but they were sincere, and sincerity is its own kind of healing. With time, I poured myself into the new consulting firm I started in my renovated attic, something small, lean, built on values that mattered to me. On some mornings, I'd sit by the window with the soft whir of my computer booting beside me, sunlight warming my forearm, and feel a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. It wasn't the scale of the old company. It wasn't meant to be. It was mine. One afternoon, I planted a row of saplings along the edge of the backyard. The soil was cool and soft, the smell of earth rich and damp on my hands. When I stepped back, wiping my palms on my jeans, the young trees stood in a gentle line, fragile now, but full of promise. Something about watching them take root mirrored my own life more than I expected. Growth didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be recognized by anyone else. It just needed room. Years passed quietly but meaningfully. I traveled when I wanted. I worked when it mattered. I rested without guilt. The house settled around me like a second skin. I learned slowly and without fanfare that healing wasn't a single moment. It was dozens of small choices. It was sitting with yourself long enough to recognize the difference between what you lost and what you never needed. It was letting go without needing anyone to see you let go. On the 5th anniversary of the confrontation, I stood on my porch at dusk, the air cool and scented with rain from a passing storm. The saplings in my backyard had grown taller than I'd ever expected, their branches swaying gently in the dim light. I watched them move with the wind, flexible, resilient, unbothered by the storms that had shaped them. And I realized that somewhere along the way, so had I. I wasn't the overlooked sun anymore. I wasn't the shadow behind someone else's spotlight. I had built a life that didn't need their approval. a life that fit the person I had fought hard to become. And if there's one truth I carry with me, it's this. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't standing up for yourself. It's believing you deserved to do it in the first place. And once you finally believe that, truly believe it, your life begins again.